Hey, everybody, welcome to the Road to Real Estate podcast. I'm John, and we have the amazing Lauren with us as always. We got a good episode for you today. I think this is our 8th episode that we're recording right now. We're really moving through these numbers. We're doing on pricing today, and we're going to attack it from several different approaches because it's not just the listing agent that needs to come up with a price for the property. But before we get into it, we have to tell you about our lovely giveaway that Lauren's going to talk about.
Yeah. Are you summer ready? Are you summer Yeti ready? Are you summer ready Yeti? We have the Yeti Roadie cooler. It's a 24 cooler that we are giving away. So make sure to check out our link below and sign up to win.
Yeah, we're not selling anything, guys. This is free. All you got to do is fill out the information and you're entered to win.
Free 99.
Yeah, free 99 is our favorite price. Also, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, follow if you're on Spotify, tell your friends about us. We're fun people. We deserve it. So,
Gosh darn it, people like us.
we hope. We can't see what they're saying on the other side of these screens. It's just you and me talking to each other. So they might just be like watching us just to make fun of us. You never know. Right, let's get this thing started. So we're doing pricing today. And I'm not sure what you want to do first. Do you want to go from showing people listings, or do you want to go from the listing agent side first?
Well, let's talk about where would you use pricing? Obviously, if you're trying to obtain a listing or if you have a listing presentation, that's your first thought, right? That's where you need to know how to do pricing. So I think that's super important. But let's just say, where else do we need pricing?
Okay, that's fair. I use them every time I show a client a home. So I like to go into the home with enough knowledge, knowing I like to be able to tell my client, like, we're inside the house, like, this one seems a little overpriced. We did a little bit of research before we got here. Obviously, until you're in the house, you're not going to know any value. But I do try to at least do a quick search before I go into the home with a buyer. So that way I look smart when I'm like, hey, I think this one's underpriced. We might be able to go over on this if we decide to put an offer in. Or I think we can go under on this one. I also call the listing agent and kind of check the activity before we get there too.
It's great, like those faster kind of price evaluations where you're just checking in to see like where are we in the market? Are we high? Are we low? Are we at market? You don't always have all the details yet, but those come in handy, right? When you're showing houses, when you're choosing an open house to do, when you need to, just walk in and have some information for even just trying to figure out, where you are. Some things are going to be automatic. You're going to know things in the area because it's just natural for areas that you know more of. But when you look at the bigger picture, there are times where your value is associated with what you can say. Now, we need to throw in a caveat here. So in the state of Georgia, you'll have to check for your state and figure out what it is. But a client obligation or a client relationship is when you talk about value, a home's value or a property's value. So that is a client agent relationship. And so I think that's an important thing to notice, that this is we don't necessarily give out the value of a property to everyone. This is something that a lot of times we do for ourselves or for our own knowledge so that we can talk more intelligently.
It's also important to note that these are not appraisals. There's a specific certification for that. So we give our best estimate when asked to try and help our clients along. But in the end, there's a completely different certification for someone to come out and do the value before someone allows the loan to go through. It is not an appraisal. Do not tell your clients that you did an appraisal unless you're certified to do an appraisal. It is very important. We try to use the same information that an appraisal person would use. It's not the same thing.
Even if you are an appraiser, you have different relationships and you have different qualifications, and so you need to speak to your broker and your appraisal company to figure out what's allowed or not allowed. So even if you happen to wear two hats, you still need to know which hat you're wearing at what time, because we have different insurances.
Yeah. And also, we all know, especially anyone that's done any homes before or been under contract, you can get two different appraisals on 2 different days that give you 2 differences of opinion. That's kind of real estate. So you do your best to get close, and who knows, the weather changes and all of a sudden the price and value change.
And that's a really important comment, Jonathan, because at the end of the day, there are 2 people that determine the price of a house, and it's not an appraiser and it is not a realtor. It is actually the buyer and the seller.
Yeah, it's
Once
there.
the buyer and seller have agreed on a price, that is the value of the property. The appraiser does come in and they'll justify it, and it can change a little bit. But the agreement between the buyer and seller is really what affects the market, because sometimes there aren't appraisal contingencies.
Oh yeah, no. You may have a buyer that thinks their house is worth way more than it is, or it could go the other way where they don't like the house, which has happened to you in the past, and they're dumbfounded that you appraised it at such a high price, you know. And the same thing can happen to a seller. The seller can look at the property and go, I want this property, and the price doesn't matter. And they can go way above asking, way above the appraisal, and cut the difference. And then at the same time, they can go, it's not worth it. I'm not going even close to what they're asking for it. And until there's an agreement upon, and that always tells people when selling anything secondhand, not just homes, is it's worth what someone's willing to pay for it. And that's what it's worth.
That's the fair market value.
So we do it for showing homes. We also do it in open houses, and I could have saved myself a big one here. I went and did an open house a while ago. We talked about it on an episode, and I didn't do my regular research. Like a last minute favor for somebody, I didn't do a lot of prep. I just walked in like I can do this, shot from the hip. And hindsight, we learned that I wouldn't have done that open house because I didn't do research on the area to see what comparable, we call it a CMA, but it's comparable market analysis. It shows likewise properties to compare with. It's exactly in the way it's defined.
And there's two different CMAs too. There's like a quick CMA where you're just doing it at a glance, and you just are looking for a ballpark. And so for an open house, like what Jonathan's talking about, you just want to know, is it above market, at market, or below market? It tells you what kind of traffic you're going to have, tells you what kind of conversations you're going to have, tells you if you want me to pull any other properties to show other clients.
Which I've also done. I've gone to open houses that right before the open house, the listing agent calls me and says, hey, just so you know, this went under contract this morning.
Dun, dun, dun.
It's like, okay, so do you cancel the open house? What do you do? So what I did is like, I want people to know that, A, it's just went under contract. We didn't know. And so I brought a lot of basically CMAs to my open house to show people, like, here's the houses within a mile, similarly priced, similarly spec'd. These are options we can go to after this open house. And so, I mean, I didn't use it to come up with the value of the home I was in because that was no longer available. So I went ahead and got similarly valuable property around the area, which is kind of the same thing. But yeah.
It's the first step of a CMA. Yeah, it's the first step. And so we'll use that term CMA, and we won't always adjust it from quick CMA to like the complex CMA. But there's definitely a good correlation to knowing the value before you get there.
Oh, yeah. Like I said, once again, we are trying to go and be the experts in the area. We talk about that every single episode. You want to be the one with the most knowledge. So it takes 30 seconds to do a quick CMA through your FMLS or Georgia MLS and give yourself an idea what you're walking into. Obviously, as soon as you open that front door, or sometimes even before you pull in the property, you go, oh, no, these numbers aren't right. And that could go good or bad for the property. It all depends. But
yeah. I mean, you never know. I mean, is the roof falling in? Is there a water leak? Is it beside a landfill? There's some things that are really hard to see until you get there. However, those are the quick ones. And then there's kind of another step, right? It's not a full CMA, but you're getting closer right before you put in an offer.
Yeah, I agree. You go a little bit more in depth, kind of, just because something's in a radius. It's also important to note that the school lines don't follow the same radius as your quick CMA. So you can look at houses in two different school systems, and depending on those school systems, there's a huge price difference, and it can really affect your numbers. So you got to go a little bit more in depth when you start to go into putting an offer in on a piece of property.
Yeah, and if you're looking in town, that may not affect you the same way. But where Jonathan and I work mostly is the suburbs. And in the suburbs, that is a huge factor for price where we are. We don't have the school choice, and if you do, it's very minimal. And so it really can drastically change if you're on the wrong side of the school line.
Definitely. So let's go into how you do your regular CMA, like not a quick one, because the quick one is for us. We can literally click a button at the bottom of our FMLS listing and tell how many houses to pick, and it kind of auto picks a bunch of houses, and you can quickly select through them. Let's do the more in-depth one, the more important one, the one that's when you're really trying to say you're going to a listing appointment. I think that's probably the most important one. It just takes more work. So let's do that. Let's walk.
There's a lot more work. And so when you talk about this full CMA, there's really two different names for it, and maybe some more depending on what area you're in. But we refer to it a lot of time as a CMA, which is the comparable market analysis, or a BPO, which is a broker's price opinion. Typically, a BPO for us in our area, that indicates that it is a paid service. Somebody is paying you for your opinion, because as we discussed, our opinion is part of our professional value, and that's something that we give clients. So a lot of times you see a BPO in a situation where there's a corporate owner. That can be a relocation company, that can be a corporation. I've also seen energy companies do it when they're buying and selling homes, and they will actually give you a fee to produce a very detailed broker's price opinion. And so what that's going to detail is that needs more than what your MLS can auto-populate for you. That's going to be you looking really deep and actually printing out, multiple pages of information. Now, a BPO is done differently depending on which company, and a lot of times they give you a spreadsheet for that. I have used spreadsheets for CMAs as well, but it gets a little dicey because everyone has a different version of it. And so if I ever do a BPO or work for a relocation company, I ask them to send me their preferred one, because there's always some kind of information that they want specifically.
Different guideline depending on who you're working for is really important.
Yeah. And most of the time you get paid for those. Those are not typically free with the BPOs. So, and they're just as detailed as a CMA, if not more, but those are typically a separate thing that you do get paid for. And so that's important to keep in mind. But I think listing presentations are where I go the deepest. Listing presentations, and then also with my investors for projections of what we sell properties for. Those are the two times that I do the most detailed listing presentation. And as Jonathan and I have talked about before, I deep dive into the research, right? I don't go surface level. I don't just hit it and hit it and quit it, right? I go pretty deep. Like I want to make sure that I know everything that person knows, because honestly, when I was a newer agent, I could go into a house and I could get embarrassed because maybe there was an off-market sale, or maybe there was a sale that didn't come up on my search. When we look at our data in the MLS as agents, we are reliant on other agents to have put in the information correctly. So think about a neighborhood that has an apostrophe. Like a Martin's Landing is a neighborhood we have here in Roswell. Does it have the apostrophe? Does it not? Does it have the S? Do they not put the S at all? These are all things that if you only look up Martin's Landing with no apostrophe, you might miss something. If there's a subsection of the neighborhood, the landings at Martin's Landing, if you're looking at these subsections, how did the agent write it? They may have written it differently.
Yeah.
And so making sure that when you're pulling it, you're pulling data in a lot of different ways, not just the way that might have user error on somebody else's end.
It's real important, especially when you get into subdivisions and stuff like that. Like even the neighborhood I live in, and it's a pretty easy one, it's Caribou Heights. You'd think that would be pretty simple. But once you start typing it in, every agent writes it a little different. And so there's 5 subdivision titles. So it's a little bit more, it takes more work to get the exact things to pull up, especially when you're trying to get really minute details. Especially, it's more important when you get into like gated communities and stuff like that, because once somebody goes into the estates of whatever, I won't make a name up, it's real easy to get those wrong. It's not as important when people are entering that information on FMLS. It's not as finicky as every other detail that they're putting in. So that one seems to have the most variation when you're trying to do research on a very specific subdivision.
Because a lot of times what we see as a legal address for the neighborhood is what the builder put in when they were just forming the neighborhood, right? And so maybe the legal neighborhood is, Hammett Heights, right? But then after they started building, they increased the price point and they wanted the estates at Hammett Heights. And so the name changes, right? And so it's not uncommon that the name on the tax record and the name in the MLS is not the same, but some agents will just copy and paste it. So important to know. Now, even though we said that it has the most errors, that's also the place I start. The neighborhood name. We live in an area that most houses are in a neighborhood. Even older ones have like a neighborhood or a community that you would describe it as. And so that's typically where I start. If I don't have a neighborhood or a community, I would start with the street name, or even just a 2-mile radius around the property, sometimes even a half-mile radius around the property, depending on how close or far the houses are.
Yeah, my thing is the radius one is the one's the most scary, because that's when you start pulling different school districts and stuff.
Yeah.
So I like to do school district in a search too. That narrows it down so it'll show everything in a radius, but they have to be in this school district, which takes that circle shape and reshapes it big time because it turns out schools don't have radiuses.
And Jonathan, that's a good point because one of the things that I do is when I do that first search, that radius search, that neighborhood search, I don't have the school in it. And then I add the school. The next thing I do is add the high school,
Mm.
then the middle school, and then the elementary school. And if I start to see a big change, like, hey, the 2 mile radius said it's 500, but once I get down to the elementary school, the average price goes down to 4. What's the difference?
Mm.
Okay, at the middle school level, what happened, and at the high school
Because you're
level,
including multiple elementary schools, so it makes sense.
right? And so you're looking to see. So one thing that I'll go back and I'll look at, I'll say, hey, this high school is more desirable based on the prices I found. I'm not really looking at data on like great schools or school digger. I'm talking about just the average price being sold in that high school district is 500, whereas the high school we're looking at, our average price is 400. We need to realize like, hey, that's a 20% difference. We need to keep that in mind when we're pricing your house. For some reason, these houses have 20% more value. We're not making a judgment on whether the school is good or bad. It is not our place to make that opinion, but we do have a place that talks about this value in this area is higher for some reason, an intangible, and it's important to keep that in mind. Now, your client might be able to say, well, yeah, that school is blah, 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 and it's the best and it's the greatest, whereas we're kind of a lower level. That's fine. Yeah. It doesn't matter.
As long as we don't voice that opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not a place where we can have an opinion because we have to think about fair housing. We're just looking at the numbers. We're not trying to get redlined. We're not trying to push people one area. We're just going for the facts.
Yeah. It turns out if you stay fact-based, you get a lot less trouble. So how many houses do you like to end up when you get to your final search? Like how
So
many?
we're not even close to my final search yet.
I know. Trust me, I know. But my thing is like, what do you start with? I mean, we're starting with a large community. When you narrow it down, what are you trying to get to?
No, I need 3 to 5 that are comparable that have sold in the past 6 months before I feel like that I have a good sample size. Occasionally we'll have something that doesn't match and we'll have to go out and find something different. But we'll talk about like that outlier in a minute. When I do these searches, I'm doing like really broad range. So 2 mile radius, maybe a half mile radius. I will do a zip code search. And so every time I'm doing these searches, I am doing the quick CMA feature that comes with our MLS. And basically that's going to tell me the highest sales price, the lowest sales price, median sale price, average sale price, how many expired, how many sold. I'm getting this data.
Yeah.
And this is where I'm going to give a little math lesson. Mean and average are the same, but median is where is the middle. And sometimes your median and average are not the same. And sometimes you're going to need to look at median price. So be prepared to explain that the median is the very center of the pricing, whereas the average, the outliers can affect it a little bit more and sway it a little more.
Yeah. A little more explanation on that. What she's talking about is, say you're looking at a bunch of houses and you're in a neighborhood and everything seems to be in the 5s. Then you have one house in that neighborhood that's listed at 7. Or one house is dilapidated and it's down at 2. Those outliers, which you just kind of mentioned that you would go into, throw off the average, because they're so far off the price of whatever else is going on in that neighborhood. So that's what she's talking about.
Yeah, be smart when you look at the numbers, right? Don't take them at face value. If something looks off or different, look at it deeper.
Yeah, see why it's off. There's usually a pretty obvious reason why it's off.
And be able to explain to your clients because they're going to be looking at the free resources like Zillow, Realtor.com, Trulia, whatever is the data in your area. And you're going to need to be able to show that you look deeper than what they saw on the surface level because you have more information technically.
Sorry to cut you off. For all you Zillow users out there, there's nothing wrong with that. But Zillow on their own Zestimate, it says it can be off by 45%. It's like it's not even close.
The standard deviation for Atlanta, the Atlanta MSA is 25%.
Okay.
However, it could be different where you live, depending on where it is. I don't think I've told this story on this podcast, but I think, Jonathan, you've heard it before. I went into a listing presentation It was a friend of a friend. It was a slam dunk. I was super excited. I was really looking forward. It was a really cool house. They had done a lot of upgrading and even put an addition on the house. And so I went in knowing that this house had like a higher value than the average house in the neighborhood. However, the people had been looking at Zillow. And so the neighborhood that they were selling in was around 300,000,
Mm-hmm.
maybe 350, maybe 4, 5 on the high end of their
This
neighborhood.
is pre-pandemic.
Pre-pandemic, yeah. You can tell by the pricing. And so the neighborhood beside their neighborhood was one street of like 1.5 to $2 million homes. And that street kind of was like this, and their cul-de-sac was kind of like this. So the algorithm of Zillow increased their price point to 750
Oh boy.
because they were really surrounded by 1.2, 2.5, but their neighborhood didn't really support anything over 450. Now they had done some really great updates. They would have probably been the highest price that ever sold in their neighborhood, and we could have pushed it to 550. But they still were $200,000 off from what I thought we could actually sell the house for. So that was like a cold, wet shower. I didn't get the listing. They didn't sell their house. It was not like,
Oh yeah, they were looking at
yeah,
that
it
with
was
the
not a great
signs in their
experience.
eyes, you know?
Yeah.
They were like, "Oh my goodness, we are sitting on a gold mine." But that's part of the problem of having someone do their CMA or something and being not doing enough research and not knowing the area well enough to be able to go in and say, "Hey, this is what it is." Now you obviously did your research. You went in there. This is the price, and now their numbers are off. And $1,000 is not a small amount of money, especially when you're in a much lower market than we are today.
Yeah, it was a deal breaker number, right? It broke the deal. So another important fact is whatever is that database that the general public is looking at, you should know. So like a Zillow's estimate of a house I'm going into for a listing presentation, I have that ready to go.
Yeah, it's good to
Zillow
know.
says your home value is this because I know that they've looked at it and that's like the red herring. And so I'm going to bring it from their closet and put it out in the light and let them know that I know what Zillow says.
It's important. Yeah, I probably could have saved the listing, maybe. You know, if you go, "Hey, this is what Zillow says," but Zillow's counting not your neighborhood, or
Well, ironically, I did have that, but they were really set on that
yeah, it
price.
was shocked. It's
Yeah,
shocking. Let's
yeah,
be
it was too
honest.
much. Yeah, it was too much. But that's okay. I mean, it like I said, they sold years and years later, but that was where they were. When I look at that, so look, so here's the things I've looked at so far. I have the Zillow,
Mm-hmm.
I have the neighborhood search, and I look at the neighborhood search of all time. I do not put a time limit. The rest of them are basically 6 months to 3 months, depending on where we are in the search. But then I'm looking at zip code, I'm looking at radius, I'm looking at high school, middle school, elementary school. I have all of that data. And then I go back to that neighborhood. So I really haven't limited criteria about things like square footage, bathrooms, bedrooms, brick or stucco, right? I haven't limited criteria because my first searches are all about the area.
Mm-hmm.
Where is the value in that area? I did a really cool graphic where I was looking at what is the average price point per high school in our North Fulton, which is an affluent suburb of Atlanta. What is the average price point? And it was really interesting because some of the areas that had the most expensive houses also had the least expensive houses. And so even though I was expecting it to be one area, the highest price was actually in a different area. So, so just knowing what the average is for that, like, hey, the average home price is 500,000 in here at 750, you might be considered luxury. Or, hey, the average price is 1.5 million at 750, you're considered entry level for this area, right? It changes your marketing and it just gives you the tools to know more about it. So once you have that area about the information or the information about the area, then we go through and we look at the house. Now, my information is going to be a little different than what you might have in your state because up until about 12, 15 years ago, it was actually illegal for agents to record the square footage in the state of Georgia.
And even with the square footage being recorded in Georgia, it's not a set thing. Basements are a thing here, and some people count the square footage because it's finished, and some people will be sitting on a house with a massive basement and they don't count the square footage. It's you just gotta go in. You have to be in the home to know for sure. You just
It's
never know here.
crazy. Yeah, some of our basements are walkouts and they're daylight and they're beautiful. Some are like cellars. Some are cellars, CELL, cellars root cellars. Others are crawl spaces that have been turned into basements. We say anything below grade in the state of Georgia, so that's even 1 inch below the dirt, is considered underground. It's considered a different type of square footage. So we talk about above grade and below grade. So anything below grade is considered the basement. And so that has a different price per square foot than the rest of the house does. So in your area, you guys might deep dive on square footage. We don't dive as deep on it because there's so many different ways to do it in Georgia.
If you're in South Florida, you've never heard of a basement. They don't have them. It doesn't exist.
They would
Everything's
flood.
on a slab.
Yeah, so that's a little more cut and dry, right?
Yeah,
The square footage is
yeah.
all the same. So even if your basement is the same level of finish as your house, even if it's the terrace level out to your pool or whatever, if it's super high end, it doesn't typically attract the same dollar per square foot as upstairs. And so that's really important to remember. So where I go next on my search is not necessarily square footage, although I do keep it in mind. But the next thing I look at is bedrooms and bathrooms. Specifically in our area, once we get to 3 bathrooms in a house, the price point changes. Right. And so if you have a 2.5 bath and somebody has 4 bath, those houses are not going to be similar unless one of them is an outlier. Right. And so next thing I'll do is I am putting in probably the high school, probably a price range at that point, because I should know, like, hey, I don't know exactly what the price is, but it's definitely going to be between 300 and 500, or it's definitely going to be between 500 and 700, right? So I'll put in a little bit of a price range so that nothing throws my numbers off too badly. And then I will start to look at number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, and then I'll estimate the square feet, right? Is it within 10 to 20% square footage wise? Does it have a basement? Does it not have a basement? Like, I start to narrow it down based on that. Now, if every property I find that's comparable has a basement and my property doesn't have a basement, that's also where I can go back and look at what is the average price or the median price for a home with a basement versus the average price and median price for a home without a basement.
Mm-hmm.
And what that does is I can take those and I can say, okay, well, the average price without a basement is $450, but the average price with the basement is $500. So on an average, if I need to make an adjustment, I can take a home with a basement and minus $50,000.
That's another important thing we should talk about. When you're doing these CMAs and stuff, you never change the subject property. You make adjustments to the comparative properties, whether you're increasing value of them or decreasing value of them, to make them compare to the property that you're selling or buying. You don't adjust the price of your property. Does that make sense when you're doing that?
Yeah, so what John was talking about is almost like if you have a spreadsheet and you have your subject property here, and then the property that you're putting, it's if you look at an appraisal, it makes sense because it's the way the appraisers do it as well. So this property that has the basement, at the bottom you say adjustment to minus basement 50,000, and so that property that sold for 500 would now look like a 450 comparable price for you. And same thing as if typically we try to avoid ones that have pools versus ones that don't have pools because it's really hard to comp out a pool. But we do sometimes, we need to.
Hey.
And so then we go through that and then we take that average of those. Once we've narrowed it down to those 5 or 6 homes that feel like they have the right bedroom bathroom combination, have the right style. I mean, it seems dumb, but we just use our eyes, right? Like, is it updated? Is it not updated? An appraiser has a category of like C1, C2, C3 as how updated or dilapidated it is. We have to just have an estimate of what we expect. Like, is it the same or not? And so once you find those properties, same comparable condition, same area, same square footage-ish, bedrooms, bath, that's where you go and you kind of take the average of them. And that's where we can start to look at square footage and price per square foot also.
Yeah.
In Georgia.
It's also important to note, she's made a comment about pools. Pre-pandemic, pools were supposedly didn't add value to your home. They would tell you that it's not going to add value to your home. Now that we've gone through a pandemic, everybody wants a pool, and it's a huge difference.
Yeah, there's like a 2-year wait list right now if you want a pool.
Yeah, it's a big difference. It's
and the price is doubled. You could get a pool for like 30,000. Now it's like 50.
It's 100,000.
Minimum.
It's 100,000. Yeah. When we first moved into this house, we were like, oh, we'll get a pool. Da, da, da. We had them come over. They measure stuff out. And they're like, okay, you're looking at $80,000. Like, okay, got to put that on a back burner for a while.
Yeah, it got a lot more expensive,
We had a
real
lot of other
fast.
work that was more important that needs to get done before we get to that, you know.
Pool's coming now. I see it. I see it in your future.
Yeah.
They're really important because they changed price during the pandemic, and so that's why keeping it really current. Like our market right now is not doing the same thing it was 2 years ago. So really, 6 months is as far back as I'll go. I do use appraisal guidelines. That 2 mile radius is an appraisal guideline. 6 months is an appraisal guideline.
Yeah.
What else?
Depending on where you live, too, 2 miles can bring you a ton of houses. If you got a ton of results coming back, you can shrink that, you know.
Yeah. Now, when we look at this and we're finalizing those numbers, there are going to be times where nothing matches. And I will use our cute little downtown areas as an example. So recently in the areas that we live in, there's really been a revitalization of these old small towns, right? You may have seen Alpharetta or Roswell or Johns Creek or Swanee or Duluth or Marietta. They all have these quaint little downtown
Little
areas.
squares and stuff where people can walk around and it's got a vibe. They all have their own little vibe. That's what
They're
it
not all
is.
the same.
They're
The
all
only
different.
similarity is walkability, right? Like
Yeah.
people want to be able to walk and get their coffee or walk to their farmer's market. And so they have these areas that are pocket areas, and you may not be able to get the same type of property in a 2 mile radius because that area is much smaller than 2 miles. And so if you can't find the square footage, if you can't find the recent sales, you're going to have to go out further. This may also be the case if you have something like a lake property where you have lake, or it could be if you have a certain amount of square footage, or even farm properties sometimes have to do this, right? And so basically you're going to look for properties that have similar attributes, even if they're not in the same zip code.
Yeah. That's a
And
little
so one
tougher.
of those examples is looking at those small, quaint towns that we see. And so there's a little section of, ironically, in Alpharetta and in Roswell, they both have an area called Canton Street. And so those little areas are priced very similarly and have similar style houses. And so those would be situations where I do like pocket this area and pocket this area because I haven't been able to find houses with the same amenities in this case being the urban vibe, walkability, and features. And typically those houses are a little more expensive than the houses in the areas that are in those neighborhoods.
So for people that aren't from Georgia, Alpharetta and Roswell are what, 45 minutes apart, half hour apart?
Like 10 minutes apart.
Are they that, oh, they're that
They
close?
touch. They touch, yeah. Alfred and Russell
Dang.
are touching.
So I don't
But
live
then you
in
look
either
at
of
like the
those, so
downtown,
to
10
me, I
minutes.
drive a half hour to one and an hour to the other. So that's the way I look at it. Like I didn't know they were that close because every time I go to our office, which is in Alpharetta, I got to go all the way down and back up, and then Roswell, I'll just go there.
No, the actual downtowns though are only 10 minutes apart.
Okay.
Yeah, if you go from like Alpharetta to Swanee, that's probably like a good 30 minutes. Or Norcross,
Yeah.
that's a good
So
20 minutes.
ignore me on that when they're 10 minutes apart, not 45 minutes.
You just see that they're big cities. Like they actually we sprawl in Georgia, and so the city from one end of the city to the other end of the city is probably 20 minutes apart. But
Mm.
from downtown to downtown, they're actually relatively close.
Huh. Learn something new every day. That's why I bring her on this podcast. She's got all the smarts.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, and actually up until maybe 10, 15 years ago, Alfreda downtown was very small, very quaint. They just went through this huge revitalization and they really put themselves on the map. And so we're seeing other cities go through that same thing as well. So there's a lot more available there than there
Every
was.
week you hear about some other cities building a downtown. Like, oh god. Well, I mean, it started out and it's a cool thing, and I think I don't know if it's since the pandemic or whatnot, but everyone's got their own little brew house and their own little, they have to have certain components to make that vibe, and it shoots up. Like what Woodstock did a really good one. Canton's doing the same thing, So it's a thing.
Coffee shops, restaurants, really good few bars, pubs kind of feel, a green space, someplace for concerts, and a farmer's market.
And
So some boutique shops. You got your.
Yeah, always a couple yoga studios,
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, obviously, let's probably try and get this back on track. We're derailing pretty hard here. All right, so now we've done our schools, we've done our physical property makeup to choose houses that are as similar as possible to the subject property. Where do we go from here? Like, what do we do next?
If there's any outliers, you need to figure out, make sure there's no outliers in the properties that you have, or outliers as far as your property's features, right? Is the driveway on a steep hill, that is going to prevent it from being sold? Is your property, does it have anything that's not desirable? Does it have PEX piping compared to, or polybutylene compared to PEX piping? Does it have a really old roof? Is the HVAC about to die? Like, are there any attributes about your property that would make it less desirable than the other properties? And you have to be really honest about this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes people forget that their property is less desirable, and you have to remind them.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking with some sellers once, and it was really funny because their sister happened to be there. And they were talking price, and they were pushing me really hard to like list them higher than what I was expecting. And the sister was kind of in the other room, but obviously listening. And she said, "Becky, you are not the highest price house. You got this for a deal because you knew the floor plan was awkward, and you're gonna have to sell it for a deal because the floor plan is still awkward." And it was magic.
Yeah, but it's good that she said it and not the realtor, because the realtor, you know what I mean? Let's get that out.
Yeah, I didn't have to say it. She was, and it was like, oh, thank God somebody said. And so we might beat around the bush and we say things like, hey, your floor plan is, has the space that is a little confusing. What do you do with it? We try to dress it up a little bit, but her sister just,
yeah, it's always
blew it
good to
out
have
there
someone's
for us.
cut and dry like that.
Yeah.
I mean, also like with the updates, for instance, the house that I'm currently sitting in, I'm in the basement of right now. It was on the market at $150,000. Don't worry, people, I didn't buy it for that. It was on the market for a long time. It was way overpriced, and we ended up paying above asking price for it. And then the appraisal happened, and it was well lower, and we still paid above appraisal on it. But it was one of those situations within the first month we were here, we had to cut out all the plumbing and replace all the plumbing. Tons of updates, but we knew that before we bought it. And it was one of those things where we went above appraising, and so the house is worth what we were willing to pay for it. So all those little features of having, because this house, when you walked into it, was 1974 through and through, from the cabinetry to the shag carpet to the thing. It was extremely well taken care of, but there was nothing. Well, that's not true. They did really nice windows. They had the Pella windows all the way around. But other than the windows, this house was original 1970 something. For most people, that's a turnoff because it didn't have all the modern updates and amenities, and that is going to affect the price point when you're putting it together. I don't know where I was going with that, but it's important.
See, the price matters, right? Like, so the thing is that for your house, the condition, even though it was 1970 and an appraiser came in and really dogged it for how old it was, because it had been so well cared for, there was more value in that property. And we know the seller saw it and you guys saw it. And so it was one of those things that we could rationalize, a small amount over the appraisal price to make everything work. And that's the way it has to happen sometimes. You are sometimes smarter than the appraiser because you know what you're willing to do. Jonathan's really great at renovations and knowing how to fix things, and they're not as intimidating for him. For a buyer that doesn't know what to do, that might be really intimidating. And so
it's tough to justify, but it just had really good bones, and we knew that going into it. We knew, well, obviously we wanted this house, so we got it. That's important because anybody, when you're showing houses to people, in your mind, what you think is a problem may not be a problem for the buyer or seller. Just because it's good for one person doesn't mean it's good for another. And that's something I've learned showing so many houses over the last couple of weeks. I'll look at something and go, oh yeah, it's nothing. And that's a deal breaker. I'm like, really? That house was so good. I don't understand why. Okay, that's the problem. Got to remember, not everybody thinks alike. So something that you may see as a positive or a negative on a house may be seen differently by the person you're showing to. And that's also going to affect how they feel about that price point you give them or it's listed at when they're walking through.
Yeah, it's a good point. I was telling somebody the other day that actually showed the same house twice recently. And the first time was to like older, like we'll say baby boomers. They're somewhere in that generation, and they came in and it had brown wood colored molding, and it had like bright gold brass chandelier in the foyer, and they thought, okay, yeah, it looks in good condition. my age says it's really dated, right?
Mm-hmm.
But so you walk through and they're like, oh, look at this good quality. The millwork and the things, oh, this is good quality, is what the baby boomer saw. Well, my next client was younger. This was not their first house, but they're probably on the younger end of millennial, older Gen Z kind of age group. We walk in and she said, oh my gosh, that chandelier. And my cynical self said, I know, right? Luckily, that's all I said.
Mm-hmm.
Because she said, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I've always wanted to own a house with a large gold chandelier. And so here is me putting my opinion on it
Yeah.
versus her putting her opinion on it. And so it's important to keep yourself out. And like you said before, stick to the data.
Yeah. It's sometimes can be a little tough because especially if you're showing a lot of houses to the same people, you kind of build a relationship to them, and they start to lean on you a little bit for your opinion. Like, what do you think? What do you see? What do you? And I try so hard to keep it to like, okay, well, I can see there's a little stain in the like obvious stuff. I'm not going to go deep into everything, but I try to keep it nothing to do with the way the house is appointed, but more upon structural actual issues, not in terms of when the sink was put in. Does that make sense? Don't get me wrong. I mean, if it's a Formica countertop versus granite or marble, that's a value thing. I can point that out. Like, this is this really common late 70s, early 80s is Formica countertop instead of nowadays we do granite or quartz or something like that. But it doesn't matter to me that the sink was put in 1972 and it's not fashionable. It probably affects the value of the home, especially for an appraiser. But if my client's happy with it, I don't care when it was put in. You know what I mean? Like, if you like that style, good for you. And I try to keep it all like this wiring doesn't look great.
Yeah.
Under the.
Is not an injunction box. And those are two separate things, right? Because we're talking about once we're in a house, helping them to see the value in the house. But also when we're doing the price opinions or the CMAs, we do have to kind of consider some of that stuff because that changes the level. Like you can't compare new construction to that
Oh, I
70s
agree
style
100%.
Formica countertop with a I call it an apartment sink, those sinks that are only about this deep,
Mm-hmm.
right? You can't compare the new
You got to
construction.
think modern. That's less water waste. Shallower the sink, the less water it can hold. So when you're doing dishes by hand, still, I'm trying to
Really
save the
bad.
planet here.
Yeah, one person. Yeah, good luck.
I'm
Good luck
doing my
with
best.
that. No, I want my nice big deep one bowl sink. I will save water. But yeah, so I think that's important to realize that when you're in person, having those opinions with the buyer going around versus also going
The
in and
factual part of it.
the factual parts. This opinion of price is more of like that listing presentation, that matter of fact, that business thing that you're going for. And I think that's super important.
Yeah. I guess I confused a lot of people there by going, well, I see this, I see that. Like, none of that actually happens when you're doing a CMA. All that stuff is adjusted after. So you do your CMA before you go in there. You can look at photos and everything else, and you can see the fixtures and everything else, and you build your price. But when you walk through a house, some of those CMAs can get thrown away.
But that's a great point, Jonathan, because most of the time when I do a CMA or a BPO, I haven't seen the house yet. And so I have most of it typed up, most of it written up, but I don't have a final number because I can always change that when I walk in. If a house smells terrible.
I was going to go right to that. I was going to go there next. You got there quick. I showed
Yeah.
a house last week and we walked in and it hit you in the face of like a really old wet dog. And it was just like, and I was like, well, it's okay. It's hardwood floors. It'll air out. And then we turned the corner and the rest of the house was all carpet and everything else. I was like, okay, it ain't going to air out that quick. Like, so that was like, it was a decent house for them. And it was full of stuff. I mean, full of stuff. And so the layout was right and everything else. And they left the house going, I don't think they could possibly get it ready in time for the time we need to move. And so they didn't even waste their time putting an offer. They're just like, no, there's no way. It's not possible. Even though the layout was right and the feel was right, the vibe they got from walking in, it doesn't matter what that price point was. For them, it was zero. That's the value. The value of that home was no, So, yeah.
Right. So it makes a difference. So most of the time, I do not have the price printed. I have a range that I have thought of and that I know specifically, and then I'm ready to defend with my numbers and my data. However, honestly, that house that I talked about that backed up to those $1 million houses that Zillow hijacked,
Yeah, pretty much.
The listing. I came in with a price around 450. And I thought that was going to be the highest price in the neighborhood. I thought they were going to be super thrilled. But then they did have some addition that I couldn't have seen online. I do think that a really great, we call it a seller pre-qualification. We talk about buyer pre-qualification, which talks about area, what they're looking for. Do they have a letter with a lender? So that's a buyer pre-qualification. But a seller pre-qualification is a conversation that I have with the seller where I do ask questions about how old is their HVAC? How old is their water heater? What type of siding do you have? Like, or is it brick? How old is your roof? These are things that I can plan for ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
The intangibles are, oh wow, you painted this whole bedroom, including the ceiling, black.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Okay. Yeah, like, okay. I write out moody decor is in.
Yeah.
There are some dark rooms that
If
look
it's big enough,
fantastic.
I'm okay with it.
Yeah.
That's the thing, is you have to have enough space to pull off dark colors. If you try to do that and you have a smaller square footage home, it feels, it cramps you down. It's weird. I painted a ceiling when I was younger, black, and put stars on it, teenage years. I thought it'd be cool, but then it felt like there was always this thing like right here, So,
Yeah. Yeah, I think, especially with that moody decor, some people do it really well and it looks beautiful. Other people totally miss the mark. You
oh yeah,
never,
oh
you
yeah, you
never
can mess
know.
it up
You
pretty
don't
easy.
know which one yours is until somebody else sees it.
Yeah, no, it's one of that's a high risk. My thing is, if you're going to a pre-listing appointment and you got your CMA and you walk into a thing like that, it's okay to mention like, hey, maybe we can change just before we go in the market, because it is going to affect people. It's better to have lighter, less, I don't want to say oppressive colors, but like any super bright or striking thing, sometimes it works, but it's going to turn some people off. Some people are going to be attracted to it as well, you know, but
But the percentage of people that are attracted to it versus the percent, you look at the bell curve. Like we're trying to hit that 80%,
yeah.
not the two 10% on either end. And so, we go through that talking about how to stage the house, any repairs that need to be completed. Sometimes if the whole house is done that way, it affects the price. If it's one room or if they have a teenager like Jonathan that needs to, I could talk to.
I was a
Yeah,
cool kid.
yeah, that's easy enough to fix. But the point being that, there are some things that you walk into that you couldn't have known ahead of time, and you have to be able to pivot. And so having that research about, like, hey, where's the outlier? How much can we deviate from this price? What's the range? Are we still in that range? People surprise me all the time. So people smoke in their houses. I know we don't see it very much down
Not
here in this
anymore,
house,
but it does
but
happen.
up
You
north
walk in,
it
right?
happens.
That's another thing on coat of paint. And here we go again. We're going to talk about the pandemic for the 12th time. It used to be that you could go into a house and if a wall or something needed to be painted or whatever, you just tell you, oh, it's a coat of paint. It's no big deal. But now to paint the interior of a home, the price has gone up so drastically. You're talking like $10,000 to $15,000 nowadays. Like it's not cheap. A gallon of paint is over $50 if you're going to Home Depot. If you go Sherman Williams and you're not a pro, it's like $1.50 a gallon now. It's a lot. it's it's not as easy to just lighten a house to get it ready for market. It might not be something they're willing to invest in before they hit the market.
Yeah, I mean, I know like our painters, go mostly to Sherwin Williams, and it's interesting how much the pricing for them has changed.
Yeah.
And everybody feels that pricing when it changes. But that's part of getting house ready. I
Yeah.
say DU, right? You got to declutter, get rid of the stuff, get rid of the things. But those will happen in time, and that's almost information that we give almost every seller. The ones that have their houses totally ready to go and staged are really the anomaly, and not,
Oh
not
yeah,
the
yeah.
yeah.
I
So
got
putting that together, flooring. Sometimes we think of flooring as old. Sometimes it's not. Jonathan mentioned shag carpet before. I mean, that would definitely be something considered outdated, and you would have to think, okay, what's the cost? What's the switch cost for that? How much do I need to take off of that? So that's why having a range is really important. But yeah, walking in and as a smoker walking in, there's something that you didn't ask or that you didn't even know you needed to ask, like are the utilities on?
Mm.
That surprised me in the past.
I actually had that panic yesterday. I went into a house and they had a large living room with 4 separate ceiling fans. And I was like, okay. And I flipped the switch, nothing. Flipped the switch, nothing. Went to the other side. There's switches on all sides. I'm like, maybe it's wired weird. Flip the switch. I'm like, I don't think we have electricity in this house. I don't know. Like, I've never showed a house without electricity before. Here we go, you know? And then, of course, I went in the other room and it turned on. It turns out all the fans had their own individual remote. And so I had to go and turn on every fan to turn on the lights to be able to see around the room, you know? But anyways, I was like, it went through my head. I'm like, I never even thought about showing a house without electricity until I can't get a light to turn on. I was like, oh,
Yeah. Jonathan, I walked into a house one time. You're gonna freak out. And it had not had power or any kind of water or gas for so long that they had composting toilets, like what you would use for camping.
oh wow.
It was awesome. Yeah.
Gotta love Georgia.
Yeah. That, I mean, it wasn't a great situation, but it changed how we had to price the house.
Oh,
right?
yeah. That's
While
a
it
big
was an
difference.
investor special, nobody was going to be able to check the water pipes, and nobody was going to be able to do that because they would have to have special permits to turn it on. And does that affect your price?
Of course.
1000%. Right? You can't sell a house that has that kind of stuff. Well, you can. You just can't expect it to get full
It's
market.
just not gonna. So my thing is, you run into that situation. There really is no CMA for that house. What do you compare that to? How do you get close? You got to subtract plumbing from a house to try and compare.
Well, I mean, technically it had plumbing. It just can't be inspected.
Yeah.
And so there does become a point where a dollar amount goes on.
You have to assume it needs replaced
brings
at that
us-
point,
Well,
right?
no, not necessarily. It didn't need replacing. I just couldn't tell you the condition it was in because I couldn't get the water turned on.
I get you. So you just.
And so you have to do that. So in those kind of situations, we do the best job we can. And that would be something where we're just looking for things in really rough condition and finding the bottom price of that area. Now, once you advertise a price that's in the bottom of an area, the market that we have right now, you're going to get multiple offers. And if you do not get multiple offers, then you have not found the bottom. And you need to go dig a little deeper. The bottom is coming. You'll be able to find it. And so what we did for that one is we just wound up going, what is the lowest price house in the neighborhood? And can we price it for that? We did. We got multiple offers on it. One of the surprises for that one was we didn't realize there were tires in the yard. We thought, oh, there's like 1 or 2 tires, no big deal. We'll just take those out, no problem. One of the people that saw the house reported us to the county. The county cited us, and I say us, I mean, I wasn't the owner, right? I was just representing the owner. However, the owner was otherwise disposed and was not able to come to the property, and so we had to handle the tire situation. It turned out, at the end of the day, oh my gosh, Jonathan, guess how many tires we got out of that yard? We thought there were like 4, maybe 5. Well, not that many.
Well, you got me so amped up. I had to throw a number out there. I was like, how many cars can you do? Like, hey, if you do, okay, we're
tires.
Yeah,
27 tires, and it was just a regular house in a neighborhood, about a half-acre yard, and we had no idea there were that many tires, and so that was something that the seller had to pay for on top of everything else because the county would not let them sell it without it. So there are surprises when you go to places. So just be ready. But that CMA, having it armed and having that information so that you can figure out how to pivot at that time is really important. The BPO is more straightforward. Most of the time you've either seen the house or you're about to see it and you have the spreadsheet all filled out and you're submitting it to a corporation. So it feels a little different. The seller's not typically a part of that. And so it is much more transactional. You'll find when you do relocation that may be submitted every week or every 2 weeks, depending on what your agreement is with that relocation company. And then if at a certain point the seller is no longer the seller of the house, the seller sells directly to the relocation company and the relocation company is the seller at that point. And then you'll have very specific BPOs and you'll get really good at them really fast because you'll have to turn those in all the time.
Yeah. So what we just told everybody is get as much information as possible and get prepared to throw it away as soon as you walk through the door. That's the best advice
you just have to be able to figure out how to adjust it depending on what you see.
What it turns out to be is every one of our podcasts comes as the more you know, just like the The
Like
old
the rainbow.
commercials. Yeah, we get the star and rainbow go across our screen right now. Like, the more you know, turns out, the better off you are in real estate. So do all your research, get everything you can to get the ideas. And then what's going to end up happening is your buyer and your seller are going to end up determining that price. And then the bank's going to throw a wrench in it by saying, no, we think it's this.
A little doomsday today, Jonathan. A little pessimistic today.
No, of all the houses I've purchased over the years, I think every one of them's underappraised. Maybe it's me. I'm a common denominator here. Actually, I don't know. I don't know about Woodstock. I don't remember where that went. I think it was
Woodstock.
Fenner.
We were close. I mean, it was within 5,000. So if I was trying to remember because I believe it did not appraise, but I think after we negotiated it, I think we ate 2.5. He ate 2.5. We met in the middle. Yeah. So like it's $2,000.
Yeah, that's nothing. That's nothing. That's appraising.
I'm always amazed at appraisers that won't give you $1,000 or $1,500 of extra value.
Yeah, I don't understand. I think that's just someone that's jaded that day.
Yes,
like that appraiser comes in and is like, "Oh, this is going to be 5,000 off." Like, you can't make that money.
Well, maybe that's a good one. We can talk about how to fight appraisals. There's actually a form and document on how to fight them.
We had a conversation about this literally yesterday. It kind of ties in, so I'll just keep the camera running. Where we were putting an offer on a house, and the lady was concerned about our contingency because of the appraisal on the property. And in my opinion, it's like, if you're worried about it not appraising, you're allowed to go when the appraiser's there and talk about all the good things in this property to help your price go through. They're independent in who they are, but you can show them the positives on the property. And although it's not supposed to affect the outcome, you're selling to them as well. So if you're concerned about $5,000 in an appraisal, be at the appraisal and go, look at this. They just redid this. This is all new countertops. These are new cabinets. They're soft close. This is, you can have an effect on that by showing them all the positives on that property, all the updates that your seller, say you're representing the seller, has done to that. You do have the ability to have some effect.
Yeah, and we can talk. That sounds like a really great future podcast because we could have a really great. I definitely have some tips and tricks that I do to help appraisals, because even though the ones that you bought were coming in a little low, the ones that we've sold have not. We hit our appraisal numbers, and I would tell you that having a packet or a plan when your house is getting appraised is really a great system.
Because people don't understand, like, I think people get so nervous about putting the offer on the house and getting their offer accepted. And then they get so worried about due diligence. And then everyone feels that the appraisal's out of their hands because it's this independent company, that they just kind of give up at that point and see what happens, and it's like, you still have an effect.
Well, the listing agent does. And so, for the buyer's agent, it's very difficult for the buyer's agent to be there, but the listing agent does. And that is really an important part of their job.
Yeah.
So.
All right, guys. That's all for today. I think we had a fun one. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember, like, subscribe, get your Get It Ready cooler, do all the things. Notification bell. It's there.
Click all the things.
Yeah, do all the stuff. And we'll see you next week. Have a good
one. Bye, guys.